What if I told you that the greatest secrets of the Victorian era were hidden not in political offices, but in ordinary women's bedrooms? In those days, personal space was considered an unallowable luxury for ladies of high society. Every minute of their lives was subject to a strict schedule and constant supervision by domestic staff. Behind heavy oak doors, an invisible struggle unfolded for the slightest crumbs of privacy and independence. Luxurious canopies and thick curtains created only the appearance of protection from the outside world. The complex system of daily life required the presence of maids from early dawn until late at night. Women of that time were physically unable to cope with everyday tasks without the help of trained assistants. Even the most personal processes of dressing and preparing for bed took place under the watchful eye of strangers. The entire architecture of wealthy homes was built around the need for discreet but constant service to the master's quarters. Watch the video to the end to learn how strict social rules and domestic duties deprive Victorian women of the right to true solitude. Are you ready to learn the truth about who was really in charge in the chambers of a noble lady? Contrary to popular belief, an aristocrat was never completely alone in her spacious room. Behind the walls of her bedchamber, a personal maid was always on duty, ready to respond to the slightest rustle of a dress. This invisible boundary between mistress and maid was blurred every night, turning the bedroom into a place of constant staff presence. A woman's life became like an endless performance, where assistants were always behind thick curtains. The service system required perfect synchronization of the actions of all the workers in the huge stone mansion. The maid was the first to step into the bedroom, disturbing her mistress's morning peace with the quiet clinking of ceramic dishes. She was entrusted with maintaining perfect order among her personal belongings, which gave her full access to the lady's secrets. The room was cleaned discreetly, but required regular visits from servants throughout the long day. Every detail of the interior, from heavy wool carpets to crystal mirrors, needed daily care. The need for constant cleaning was dictated by the difficult living conditions of a large industrial city with its factories. Coal dust settled on the surfaces of carved furniture, requiring continuous wiping and cleaning of expensive fabrics. The abundance of decorative elements in the interior only complicated the task of maintaining perfect and impeccable cleanliness. Carved oak bed backs, thick tapestries, and velvet curtains accumulated huge amounts of fine street dust. Caring for these expensive items required the efforts of several lower-level workers. They regularly invaded the lady's personal space to dust and polish the massive bronze details. The bedroom became a full-fledged workplace for a whole team of trained and efficient professionals. The personal maid acted as the main coordinator of all these hidden processes of daily service. She carefully ensured that the junior maids did their work quickly and without unnecessary noise. However, even the quietest presence of outsiders inevitably disturbed the long-awaited peace of the mistress of the rich chambers. The lady had to constantly change her location, moving from the boudoir to the living room, so as not to interfere with the large-scale cleaning. Her own house dictated her routes of movement, forcing her out of her most comfortable and familiar personal corners. In addition to physical service, the servants acted as a kind of living clock for their noble mistress. Strict adherence to a strict schedule was the main indicator of high status and good taste in high society. The maid delicately reminded her mistress of mealtimes, mandatory changes of clothes, or visits from important guests from the capital. The woman effectively handed over control of her time to an experienced hired worker. She moved through life according to a schedule drawn up by someone else, with no right to make sudden, spontaneous decisions. Under such conditions, the huge bedroom completely lost its status as a sacred and absolutely inviolable refuge. It became just another functional area of a large and complex domestic mechanism. The lady was more of a high-ranking guest in her own chambers than their sovereign and independent mistress. Real life at home was constantly bustling behind closed doors, where servants performed their routine duties. This sharp contrast between external luxury and internal lack of freedom defined the essence of the entire historical era. The upper classes were under the constant scrutiny of their own loyal domestic servants. We would be very interested to hear your opinion on such constant control of personal life. Please write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. I discovered this by accident. The early morning of a Victorian lady always began long before she opened her eyes. Maids silently entered the cool room to carefully light the dying fireplace and bring in new firewood. They carried heavy copper jugs filled to the brim with hot water from the heated kitchen boilers. The woman woke up to the sound of clear water flowing and the crackling of dry birch logs burning. Then began the complicated process of morning ablutions, which required the assistance of at least one experienced maid. Water was poured into a large porcelain basin, placed on a special wooden stand with carved legs. The maid served clean soap, prepared towels, and made sure that the water did not cool down too quickly. It was strictly forbidden by the rules of good manners for a noble woman to lift heavy jugs herself. Thus, even ordinary washing turned into a team effort between two completely different people. After the corset came the turn of numerous petticoats, which created the necessary volume for the dress. They were sewn from thick natural fabrics and lavishly decorated with rows of heavy lace ruffles. The maid fastened countless small buttons and hooks on the back of her patient mistress one by one. It was completely impossible to reach these fasteners on her own because of the cut of her outer clothing. The final stage was putting on the morning dress, intended exclusively for breakfast with the family. Breakfast was usually served in a small morning room, flooded with bright morning light from large windows. The maid followed her mistress, carrying a warm woolen shawl or her favorite book for reading. A footman was already in the dining room, setting out porcelain cups and silver trays with warm food. Every bite of bread and sip of tea was accompanied by the presence of people dressed in strict uniforms. Personal space was reduced to the size of a dining chair surrounded by a wall of attentive observers. After breakfast, the lady had to meet with the housekeeper to discuss household matters in the menu. This meeting took place in the library or living room, where the servants lined up to receive new orders. The woman ran a huge house, but she did so exclusively through intermediaries without touching the work herself. She allocated finances, checked the account books, and listened to reports on the state of the wine cellars. Her entire morning routine was devoted to keeping this gigantic residential mechanism running smoothly. The morning hours flew by unnoticed in a series of mandatory meetings, endless changes of clothes, and routine checks. The woman did not belong to herself, fulfilling the role of chief manager within her luxurious residence. Her status required constant involvement in processes that were actually controlled by experienced servants. Even a casual glance out the window was often interrupted by a maid's question about the choice of dress for the upcoming walk. Are you ready to find out how these strict rules transformed with the onset of evening twilight? What I am about to show you is forbidden in modern notions of comfort and personal independence. Removing a complex Victorian outfit without assistance was a physically impossible task for any noble lady. Dozens of hidden hooks, tight lacing of a stiff corset, and heavy petticoats required the skilled hands of a personal maid. The process of undressing took more than an hour and was always accompanied by routine conversations with the maid by candlelight. At this moment, the woman was as restricted in her movements as possible and completely dependent on her nimble assistant. An evening gown for formal dinners could weigh several kilograms due to the abundance of velvet, beads, and thick silk. The maid carefully removed this expensive masterpiece of tailoring, trying not to damage the fragile decorative elements. The dress could not simply be thrown on a chair. It had to be carefully examined for accidental stains. The maid armed herself with special brushes to remove the dust that had accumulated on the long hem during the long evening. At this time, the mistress stood in her undergarments, waiting for the completion of this mandatory cleansing ritual. Freedom from the tight corset brought enormous physical relief after many hours in high society. The maid slowly untied the strong laces, allowing the woman's lungs to finally fill with deep breaths of air. Deep red marks from the stiff whalebone stays and steel plates often remained on the skin. This process required delicacy, as a sudden loosening of the lacing could cause severe dizziness in the tired lady. The maid always kept a bottle of smelling salts at the ready in case her mistress suddenly felt unwell. Evening washing also took place with hot water, which the younger maids brought in heavy jugs. The lady wiped her face with damp sponges, washing away traces of heavy makeup consisting of lead, white, and rouge. The maid handed her dry cotton towels and applied nourishing almond oil-based creams to her skin. All these hygiene procedures were performed in the presence of another person, which completely ruled out any intimacy in the process. The bedroom was filled with thick steam from hot water and the strong scent of lavender soap. The nightgown was sewn from the finest white batiste and decorated with intricate hand embroidery around the edges of the collar. It was long, completely covering the legs, and had long sleeves to protect against the nighttime chill of the huge house. The maid helped her put on this loose-fitting garment and fastened several small buttons on her mistress's chest. Only then could the lady finally approach her high bed, prepared for sleep. But even at this point, the process of serving was not considered complete for the devoted maid. The maid had to tidy up all the things that had been scattered during the long and tedious evening of undressing. She folded the petticoats into tall oak chests of drawers and hung the daytime dresses in spacious wardrobes. The room was tidied up to perfection so that nothing would disturb the aesthetic perception of the lady when she woke up in the morning. The coals in the fireplace were stirred with a long poker to ensure an even and long burn throughout the night. All these actions were accompanied by the quiet rustling of fabrics and the metallic clinking of fireplace accessories. When the woman finally lay down on the high pillows, the maid blew out most of the candles in the spacious room. She left only one small source of light so that her mistress could find her way in the dark if necessary. After that, the maid silently left the bedroom, but remained in the adjoining room, ready to return at the first call. An invisible thread of control was stretched, connecting the sleeping aristocrat and her awake guard behind a thin wall. Be sure to like this video if you are also struck by these strict and tedious rules of the past. Want to know a secret that will change your life and make you appreciate modern standards of personal comfort? In large Victorian homes, spouses very rarely shared a bed throughout the long night. More often than not, they had adjoining rooms connected by a common interior door for rare and agreed-upon visits. This division of space allowed the husband to maintain his work schedule without disturbing his wife's long morning preparations. The servants were always well aware of their employer's movements, meticulously noting every detail of their hidden life together. Separate bedrooms were considered a sign of high status and material well-being for a large aristocratic family. This meant that the house was large enough to provide each spouse with personal space and their own servants. The male half of the house was decorated in dark colors, with an abundance of heavy wood and leather-smoking furniture. The female bedroom was distinguished by light shades, floral wallpaper, and elegant mahogany furniture. The transition from one area to another was perceived as crossing an important invisible boundary within the same building. This arrangement ruled out the possibility of casual morning conversations or spontaneous time spent together. Marriage was seen more as a successful business partnership, where each side had clear duties and areas of responsibility. Communication between husband and wife often took place in the formal setting of the living room or at the long dining table. They exchanged polite phrases, discussing the weather, the health of distant relatives, or plans for an upcoming dinner party. Genuine sincerity and warmth were often lost behind a facade of perfect manners and strict upbringing. If the spouses did sleep in the same bed, it created enormous difficulties for the domestic staff serving them. The maid and valet had to coordinate their actions so as not to interfere with each other in the confined space. Bringing hot water and preparing clothes became a complex logistical task requiring perfect timing. The servants tried to move as quietly as possible so as not to disturb the sleep of the other spouse with their sudden movements. This tense atmosphere made the morning hours very uncomfortable for all the inhabitants of the huge bedroom. The wife's pregnancy brought even greater changes to the established routine of the noble family. The expectant mother spent most of her time in her room, observing strict bed rest as recommended by doctors. The number of staff serving her chambers increased significantly with the addition of nurses and extra maids. The room was transformed into a veritable hospital ward, where water was constantly boiled and special herbal decoctions were prepared. During this period, the woman was under round-the-clock and absolutely total supervision by hired workers. After the birth of the child, the situation did not change, as the care of the baby was completely shifted to the shoulders of experienced nannies. The wet nurse and junior nannies lived in a separate wing of the house, called the nursery, with their own schedule. The mother visited her child only at strictly designated hours, demonstrating her affection in the presence of the staff. Raising heirs was considered too difficult a task to entrust to an unprepared aristocrat without special education. The woman was once again left alone with her personal maid in an endless cycle of social obligations. Under such conditions, the relationship between the spouses was based on mutual respect and social distance. Passion and romance often gave way to pragmatism and concern for preserving the impeccable reputation of the ancient family. They lived under the same high roof but existed in parallel worlds that intersected only according to schedule. The main witnesses to their real lives were their loyal servants, who knew all the weaknesses and habits of their noble employers. What secrets do you think the dark corridors of Victorian mansions held in the quiet of the night? The layout of a typical Victorian mansion was a complex labyrinth with a dual purpose. The main reception rooms were intended for lavish receptions and to demonstrate the family's high social status. Behind them lay a whole network of narrow corridors and hidden wooden staircases for the quick movement of servants. These hidden passages ran through the entire house from the basement to the attic, providing the servants with access to every part of the huge building. In this way, the maids could appear in their mistress's bedroom completely silently and at any moment. Such houses were built with a strict separation between the owners and their numerous servants. The grand staircase was covered with expensive carpets and was intended exclusively for the owners of the estate and their important visitors. Servants used steep and poorly lit wooden steps hidden behind inconspicuous doors in dark corners. Crossing these two worlds in the wrong place was considered a gross violation of established household discipline. Footmen and maids were supposed to remain in visible shadows, ensuring comfort and cleanliness in the luxurious halls. Doors leading from the service corridors to the master's rooms were often disguised as bookcases or wooden panels. A maid could open such a secret door to silently check the temperature in the room or collect dirty dishes. This architectural trick created the illusion that the house served itself without the involvement of living people. Fresh flowers appeared in vases, and fireplaces blazed as if by magic. However, behind this magic was the hard physical labor of people moving through dark and dusty passageways. The basement of the house was a veritable underground factory producing comfort for the inhabitants of the upper floors. It housed huge kitchens with cast-iron stoves, laundries with copper boilers, and wine cellars with rows of bottles. The noise, heat, and smells of cooking remained downstairs, not penetrating the front rooms thanks to a ventilation system. Servants spent most of their lives in these semi-basement rooms, performing heavy and monotonous manual labor. Their world was limited by brick walls and narrow windows overlooking the cobblestone street. The attic rooms were used as bedrooms for the younger female staff, where they slept on hard iron beds. In summer, it was unbearably stuffy under the roof, and in winter, the water in the jugs froze due to the lack of proper heating. The girls woke up long before dawn to light the kitchen stoves and prepare water for the master's morning toilet. Their personal space was limited to a small wooden chest for storing their modest uniforms and meager savings. They lived in constant tension, waiting for the bell to ring, which could interrupt their short and restless sleep. The husband's study and the wife's boudoir were often connected by a special service corridor for the quick exchange of important notes. Servants scurried along this passageway, carrying urgent letters, fresh newspapers, or trays of light snacks. This layout allowed the couple to communicate without leaving their private areas or going out into the common corridors. The house was built like a fortress, where each resident had their own strictly designated territory and safe routes for movement. Any deviation from these prescribed paths caused discontent and severe reprimands from the senior housekeeper. Such a complex structure of the mansion made the cleaning process incredibly laborious and time-consuming for the entire staff. The maids had to constantly climb up and down steep stairs, carrying heavy buckets and brushes. They cleaned not only the formal rooms, but also all the hidden passageways so that dust would not be carried throughout the house by drafts. The architecture of the Victorian house was an ingenious engineering solution, but it completely excluded the concept of equality and freedom. The building itself was an instrument of control, dividing people into invisible workers and high-ranking observers. For the lady of the house, these hidden doors meant that she could never be sure of her absolute solitude. At any moment, a wooden panel could slide silently aside, letting a person with a tray or a brush into the room. The feeling of a constant invisible presence made her keep her back straight and watch her tired face. Even when she was really sad or happy, she had to remember that someone might be watching her. Her house protected her from the crowds outside. but it also took away her basic right to be honest behind closed doors. Guess what happened next when the cold sun set behind the horizon of a large industrial city? Before the advent of electricity, huge bedrooms were lit by wax candles and oil lamps, which required constant attention. Leaving an open flame on for a long night was too dangerous due to the high risk of a large and destructive fire. Therefore, maids regularly checked the living quarters, extinguished unnecessary candles, and carefully monitored the smoldering coals in the fireplace. These nightly rounds made it impossible for women to get even a few hours of uninterrupted, peaceful, and deep sleep. Oil lamps provided brighter and more even light, but required complex and painstaking daily maintenance. Maids had to trim burnt cotton wicks, clean soot from glass bulbs, and refill combustible liquid. When burning, these lamps gave off a specific smell that was absorbed into heavy curtains and soft upholstery. If the wick was not adjusted correctly, the lamp would start to smoke heavily, covering expensive light-colored furniture with a black coating. This complex process of controlling the light required a certain amount of skill and the constant presence of a trained person in the room. Wax candles were used in large quantities to create a cozy atmosphere during long evening conversations. However, they burned quickly, leaving drops of melted wax on silver candelabra and polished wooden tables. Maids armed themselves with special sharp scrapers to clean these hardened drops from surfaces. They also made sure that the candle flames did not spread to dry flower arrangements or paper wallpaper. All this firefighting took place in complete silence, while the owners of the house rested or read books. The use of gas lighting, which appeared in the middle of the century, brought new problems and new causes for serious concern. Gas lamps gave off a very bright light, but they posed a hidden threat of fatal poisoning in the event of an accidental leak. Servants had to carefully check all the copper valves before finally turning off the lights for the night. The smell of gas often seeped into the rooms, causing severe headaches and bouts of suffocation among the inhabitants of the house. This new technology required even stricter and more meticulous control on the part of the senior service staff. In the morning, the process of restoring light to the house began long before the owners opened their sleepy eyes. The younger maids carried fresh candles, refilled empty oil lamps, and cleaned the fireplaces of gray cold ashes. They opened the heavy shutters on the windows, letting the first faint daylight into the dark rooms. The house slowly awoke, filling with the sounds of footsteps, the clatter of dishes, and the creaking of wooden floorboards in the corridors. This endless cycle of lighting and extinguishing fires determined the rhythm of life for everyone in this huge building. For a Victorian woman, this process meant that she never had control over her own living conditions. She couldn't just flip a switch to plunge her bedroom into complete and comfortable darkness. She had to ask someone else to do it, giving a verbal order and waiting for it to be carried out precisely. The light in her room did not belong to her, but to a complex system of domestic management operating according to strict rules. It was yet another constant reminder of her invisible social shackles within her own wealthy home. The darkness held many real dangers, from burglars to accidental falls on the steep stairs of the house. Therefore, the presence of night guards from among the trusted servants was perceived as an absolute and vital necessity. A maid with a lantern accompanied her mistress on any nighttime journey through the long and gloomy corridors of the mansion. The footsteps of the two women echoed in the silence of the huge house, emphasizing their strange and inseparable bond. They were together during the most vulnerable and frightening hours of the day, united by a common fear of the dark unknown. How did women cope with the constant presence of strangers in their daily lives? A Victorian lady's dressing room was a separate, spacious room, completely under the control of the head maid. The maid knew every expensive item belonging to her mistress, from bulky evening gowns to the smallest details of underwear. She checked the condition of the silk fabrics daily, cleaned the long hems of street dust, and gave instructions to the laundresses. The mistress of the house rarely chose what to wear herself, relying on the practical advice of her personal assistant. This control over her belongings gradually grew into a strong, invisible power over the most high-ranking woman. Clothing in that era was incredibly expensive and required very careful, professional, and regular care. A wine stain or an accidental hole in the hem could irrevocably ruin an outfit worth a small fortune. The maid possessed the complex secrets of removing difficult stains with lemon juice, salt, and harsh chemical solutions. She spent hours carefully sewing up loose seams and attaching detached mother-of-pearl buttons to thick fabric. Her skill directly determined the appearance and public reputation of a noble lady at important social events. The process of washing underwear was hidden from the eyes of the mistress, but required tremendous physical effort from the kitchen laundresses. Thin cotton shirts were boiled in huge copper vats, rubbed on ribbed boards, and wrung out by hand. The maid strictly controlled this rough process so that the aggressive soap would not damage the delicate hand embroidery on the collars. After drying, the linen was heavily starched and ironed to a crisp with special metal presses heated on coals. The lady's bedroom was returned with perfectly clean and folded items, smelling of freshness and dry field lavender. The maid was also responsible for selecting the right accessories for each specific dress for going out. She knew which hats went with certain coats and which umbrellas best matched summer outfits. The mistress often simply stood in front of a large mirror while the maid applied various silk ribbons to her face. The final aesthetic choice often remained with the maid, as she was more knowledgeable about the color nuances of fabrics. This made the woman a kind of mannequin for demonstrating the taste and professionalism of her personal employee. Traveling by train or carriage required the collection of a huge number of massive leather trunks and travel boxes. The maid meticulously packed the dresses so that they would not wrinkle during the journey, using layers of thin tissue paper. She made detailed lists of necessary items, including medicines, cosmetics, and spare hooks for tight corsets. On the road, the maid guarded the luggage and ensured her mistress's comfort in cramped train compartments or cold hotels. The lady was completely helpless on the road without her faithful assistant, unable even to fasten her traveling cloak. The senior personal maid also had complete control over old or out-of-fashion items. She had the unspoken right to take her mistress's worn-out dresses as a kind of bonus to her small salary. This created a strange situation where the maid had a financial interest in her noble employer, frequently changing her wardrobe. Sometimes maids sold these expensive dresses to special second-hand shops, receiving a very substantial monetary bonus. Clothing management turned into a hidden economic system within a large and complex aristocratic household. Thus, clothing ceased to be a woman's personal property and became an object of joint and complex management. The lady wore these beautiful things, but the real owner of the secrets of silk and velvet was her inconspicuous maid. This constant control over the wardrobe deprived women of the opportunity to spontaneously change their appearance according to their mood. Every time they left their room was the result of long joint work, in which the initiative often did not come from the mistress herself. External beauty and elegance were achieved at the cost of a complete loss of personal freedom in choosing one's everyday appearance. The relationship between a noble lady and her personal chambermaid always balanced on a fine line between friendship and dependence. The maid knew absolutely all the secrets of her mistress, accidentally read her personal letters, and heard candid conversations. She became the silent keeper of secrets that could instantly destroy the reputation of an entire wealthy aristocratic family. Often, women trusted their maids much more than their own husbands or close blood relatives. But this closeness carried with it a huge social danger in the event of a sudden quarrel or unfair dismissal. The maid spent more time with her mistress than anyone else in the huge stone house. She was there during moments of illness, deep sorrow, hysterics, and nervous breakdowns behind the closed oak doors of the bedroom. The maid comforted the lady, brought her sedatives, and listened to complaints about her cold husband or strict mother-in-law. A strong emotional attachment developed, erasing the rigid class boundaries within one small cozy room. However, outside the bedroom, they became mistress and hired servant again, obliged to observe strict social etiquette, emotional support for her weary mistress. She had to be tactful, knowing when to remain silent or say the right words of comfort in difficult moments. The maid often acted as a lightning rod for the lady's irritation and anger after an unsuccessful social evening. She silently endured whims and nitpicking, understanding that this was part of her difficult and low-paid professional work. This psychological burden made the profession of chambermaid one of the most difficult and exhausting among all domestic staff. Sometimes relationships between women grew into genuine affection, bordering on familial and sincere love. The chambermaid became the lady's invisible shadow, anticipating her slightest desires and protecting her from minor everyday troubles. They grew old together, sharing memories of their past youth and former triumphs at glittering capital balls. In such cases, the line between servant and companion was completely blurred, turning them into inseparable, loyal friends. However, such stories were rather a rare exception to the harsh and pragmatic rules of the austere Victorian era. For the rest of the servants in the house, the chambermaid was a person with a special and very high privilege status. She had direct access to the mistress and could influence her decisions regarding the dismissal or hiring of other employees. Junior maids and footmen fawned over her, trying to gain her favor and protection from the wrath of the strict housekeeper. The chambermaid dined in the senior servants' room, receiving better food and better cheap wine. Her position aroused both envy and respect, making her a central figure in the complex hierarchy of the basement. Despite the outward trust, the lady always had to remember the class divide between her and her assistant. Too much candor could lead to familiarity and a loss of authority in the eyes of the rest of the household staff. The woman was in a constant state of tension, controlling her words and emotions even in the most relaxed evening hours. She could not allow herself to be completely weak and defenseless in front of a person from a lower social class. This mask of a strong mistress grew attached to her face, not coming off even during the long process of undressing in the evening. Her life was turning into a reality show for one very attentive and incredibly observant regular viewer. Every sigh, every tear shed was recorded and remained in the memory of the person standing directly behind her. It was impossible to escape this gaze, as it was an integral part of her high and privileged status. The day of a Victorian woman from high society was scheduled literally by the minute from the earliest and coldest morning. Changing from heavy dresses for family breakfast, a long walk, receiving guests and dinner took an enormous amount of time. In the short intervals between changing clothes, a lady had to do embroidery, read the right books, or play music. She had no free time left for idle thoughts or simply being in silence. Her whole life turned into endless work to maintain her high and impeccable social status. The schedule was strictly dictated not by the woman's personal desires, but by the strict and unyielding rules of social etiquette. Being late for a dinner party or appearing in the wrong dress was considered a terrible and unforgivable social crime. The maid kept a close eye on the time, regularly bringing the watch and reminding her of the need to start preparing for the next event. A lady was like a wound-up mechanism that had to move along a clearly defined and unchanging circular trajectory. Stopping or deviating from the route threatened a loss of reputation and immediate condemnation by the whole of society. Charitable activities which were encouraged in society also fit into this incredibly strict and busy schedule. Women visited orphanages, organized bazaars, and raised money for the poor. However, these trips were accompanied by servants and were more a demonstration of virtue than actual hard work. Maids carried baskets of gifts while the lady gave instructions without dirtying her clean white gloves. Even in her most noble impulses, an aristocrat remained under the strict supervision of her attentive staff. Writing long letters and keeping a personal diary were the only intellectual pursuits available during the day. The woman would sit at her desk in her boudoir, writing neat lines in beautiful, even calligraphy. But even at that moment, a maid could be in the room, sorting clean clothes in a huge wooden wardrobe. The sounds of a scratching pen mixed with the rustle of thick fabrics, preventing her from completely immersing herself in her deep thoughts. Personal space on paper remained the only place where the maid could not enter without direct permission. The weekends did not bring the desired relief, as they were devoted to church attendance and large family dinners. Sunday services required special formal attire and a long stay in the cold stone building of the old cathedral. After church, the family gathered around a long table where traditional meat dishes and sweet fruit puddings were served. Servants bustled around, changing heavy porcelain plates and pouring wine into the guests' tall glass goblets. The tension of being constantly in public did not ease for a single moment throughout the week. As a result, the lack of physical privacy was compounded by a complete lack of psychological and emotional freedom. Living under constant supervision shaped a particular type of character, prone to secrecy and strong internal control. The lady learned to hide her tears behind a wide fan and her anger behind a polite and cold, forced smile. The bedroom with its numerous maids was merely a reflection of the vast theater in which a woman played her role. Getting rid of these invisible shackles was more difficult than removing the tightest and heaviest evening whalebone corset. With the dawn of a new century, the strict rules of Victorian morality began to gradually and irrevocably lose ground. Technological progress brought electric lighting, central water heating, and full plumbing to large city homes. The need for a huge staff of servants to constantly and laboriously maintain the household began to rapidly and universally disappear. Women were able to take care of their own clothing thanks to a sharp change in fashion trends and fabrics. Bedrooms finally became truly private spaces, where outsiders were strictly forbidden by the rules. The advent of central heating eliminated the acute need for dirty fireplaces and maids carrying heavy buckets of coal. The temperature in the room was maintained at a comfortable level by a system of hot cast iron radiators along the brick walls. Morning wake-up calls were no longer accompanied by the loud sounds of ash being swept away and the acrid smell of thick wood smoke. A woman could sleep in silence and warmth without waking up from the cold in her spacious, bright bedroom. This technological breakthrough was the first step towards achieving true, physical privacy within the confines of one's own huge house. Hot water flowing directly from copper taps in new bathrooms became another miracle of technological progress. There was no longer any need to carry heavy jugs of boiling water up the steep and dark service stairs of the huge building. A lady could take a warm bath on her own, locking herself inside a bright room with a reliable metal latch. The process of washing became deeply personal and intimate, no longer requiring the presence of prying eyes and helpful hands. The bathroom became a new sacred refuge where a woman could be completely alone with her thoughts. The reduction in the number of servants led to serious changes in the layout of new houses and the reconstruction of old stone mansions. Secret corridors and hidden staircases were boarded up as unnecessary or converted into convenient built-in wardrobes. The servants' rooms in the cold attic stood empty, as only a few people were now needed to run the house. The boundaries between the formal areas and the service quarters became less rigid and more permeable for all residents. The house ceased to be a complex mechanism and became a place for a small family to live comfortably and cozily. The relationship between the mistress and her remaining servants also took on a completely different, more professional and businesslike character. The forced emotional closeness, born of endless hours spent together in a closed room, disappeared. The maid did her job of cleaning the house and went home to her family, no longer spending the night in the cramped adjoining office. The woman ceased to depend on her servants physically and psychologically, gaining long-awaited freedom of action in her own home. The secrets of the bedroom were no longer the subject of discussion in the kitchen among the numerous and talkative lower staff. This transitional period became a time of massive liberation for women of high society from invisible domestic shackles. They learned to comb their own hair, button their own buttons, and turn on the lights in their dark rooms. Solitude, once considered an unaffordable luxury, became a familiar and integral part of their renewed daily lives. The bedroom became a place where one could shed one's social mask and be oneself without the judgmental gaze of others. It was a great achievement of the era, changing the very essence of female existence within traditional European culture. What other little-known facts about the logistics of everyday life in past eras would you like to see in future videos? Suggest your topics in the comments, and the most interesting ones will definitely become the basis for new scenarios. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on fascinating insights into the complex history of everyday human life.